Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and joining me today is co-host Josh Heath. Josh, Agent Heath, how you doing?
I am doing really well. How are you today, Terry?
I'm doing fine. It's been kind of an exciting week, and you seem to have gotten some outside time. You have a glow about yourself that I haven't seen in our most recent recordings. Maybe that's because we did a lot of recording over winter where you're like, I saw a photon today. I'm like, oh man, that's nice. I almost saw one, but it was stopped by a cloud.
Sounds about right. I am no sunnier in personality than I usually am, though. So, I'm just sun-kissed a little bit.
Yes, it's always sunny in Joshadelphia. We are talking today about kind of the cosmic entities of the world of darkness. And this is something that is subject to a lot of debate because anytime several game lines run into each other, that is unavoidably going to happen. We are going to talk about things that are kind of at the Celestine level or higher. In Mage the Ascension, we get a number of hierarchies of spirit entities or non-corporeal entities. It is just a scattershot list in M20. Previous editions tried to do various things, but they don't always agree with each other. As of M20, we have the notion at the top that there's something like God, or the adversary, or the goddess, or the divine mother, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff below it. The adversary is kind of a new one, the cosmic principle of opposition, which it kind of specifically says is not necessarily the Wyrm, which this would sit above. So things we are not going to talk about. The pure ones, the Tuanadadanan, the Elohim, the Nephilim, other such things. So we've kind of identified the 8 entities or so that seem to fit it, and we're just going to bounce back and forth and talk about these. But before we do, Josh, you tend to have a lot more chronicle experience than me. Have you ever used like a big honking entity like this in a game?
In some ways, I have occasionally had Gaia and or Helios's presence felt, but I haven't really used them as a, hey, here is a NPC that you are going to meet in person. I sort of did that with Helios once, but it was much more of it's not really them. It's just a avatar of an avatar of an avatar.
Yeah, we have the idea of emanations that, sadly, unlike Exalted, we rarely get actual stats for God. Satyros Filbricato, give us stats for Jesus, you coward. For listeners, that is a running joke I have, so I am not actually formally requesting those, although if such a listing were to appear on the Storyteller Vault for April 1st, I would be very pleased to see that, as blasphemous as that would be in the eyes of many. You are frequently not dealing with the entity itself because it is large and imponderable. For instance, does Werewolf answer the question of, is the Celestine the body? For instance, is Luna the moon? And if the answer is yes, it's hard to talk to a moon. They're big generally.
It explicitly doesn't answer that question. It is very much like, this is an emanation that you can talk to, but it is not Luna herself necessarily. And you kind of go, but is it? But isn't it?
Yeah. So a lot of these entities, you would not interface with them directly so much as they're lessers. But even those are pretty fascinating. And again, we're not necessarily going to talk about those, nor are we talking about entities that have a great degree of collective power. For instance, the pure ones, if they were a thing, together combined form the avatar of all mages. And if you sum the power of all the avatars in existence together, that's got a lot of oomph behind it. But they themselves are not quite discrete entities. So we kind of have to make an arbitrary pick. In second edition, these were known as greater entities. Sometimes they are referred to as Celestines. In other cases, they are held above Celestines. But let's get started. Josh, who's your favorite of these?
Well, I'm going to start with Gaia to begin with. Gaia being the spirit of the earth mother, the progenitor of all changing breeds. In theory, the progenitor of all beings on the planet, though that is called into question by werewolf lore in particular. And I actually am not 100% sure mage lore gives you a firm answer one way or the other there. Gaia is this being of incomprehensible authority and power because everything that exists that is life that is on this planet is part of her, and vice versa. Everything is element of her as well. It goes back and forth between, who is visualizing and who is being visualized. In some ways, as a being, Gaia exists as an ultimate pushback against the idea of the consensus, because if there is a single spiritual entity that is in control and or the progenitor of all things on life? Gaia then a willful being who can bring things into existence or affect the consensus? Or is Gaia a being that exists because the consensus believes she exists? That is a fundamentally unknowable question that could be an entire chronicle on its own. Like, is Gaia a entity that you can comprehend in one form or another?
And we get a couple ways to look at this. One of them could be the fact that Gaia is literally all life. And that to talk about that would be meaningless. And in that, Gaia is literally, for instance, the principle of evolution. And it may be one of those things where that throws off emanations that a character could interact with. It could also be the case that these stories that we have about Gaia take place over what is often presented as centuries or millennia, but if Gaia is the principle of life and evolution, may have taken millions or billions of years. So Gaia may still be talking, but we cannot make out what Gaia is saying in the same way that you cannot listen to a record that is rotating at a rate of one revolution a century. We just don't have the tools to pick up on that.
The answer that Werewolf provides is a being in Rage Across the Heavens that is an avatar, explicitly an avatar of Gaia called Eshtara, that you can meet with and interact with and have dealings with. However, that book is very bad about not identifying if then she is Gaia, and the kind of big question, particularly in Werewolf, I think this reflects in Mage, is like, if she is being capable of speaking for Gaia, then Gaia must be awake and interacting with the world and aware and in some ways either happy with or uncomfortable with werewolves and their behavior. But there's so much in the game line that makes it seem that Gaia is probably either dead or dying and or an absentee landlord, like, some believe God is. And it begs a sort of like consensus formed question on if Eshtara is the avatar, maybe the werewolves just created her as a answer to their belief in Gaia, and she's not actually Gaia. And then therefore none of the Celestines in Rage Across the Heavens are probably actually beings of anything other than what the werewolves have dreamed into existence.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid answer, that Gaia could just be an egregore, a being, or a tulpa created of our belief that there is an entity named Gaia. If Gaia represents all life, as there's been an explosion in complexity and biological power, Gaia may be going through a similar transformation, and the Gaia we knew no longer exists. And maybe an entity like Autochthonia, the living machine realm planet, may be closer, but like a biological mirror of that. I also like the idea that you kind of initially mentioned is, in Mage, we kind of get the idea that there are three different sources for what is and isn't vulgar. A big chunk of it is the consensus. Another chunk of it is history, historical inertia, and the memory of the land. And another portion is just kind of fundamental laws of the universe. Destroying an avatar is always vulgar with witnesses. You could argue that is because the avatar is witnessing it, and it's like, no, bad. But I like the idea that Gaia could be the embodiment of the principle of natural inertia, that there is a magic to places and she is the sum total of all of those. So if I'm a mage in a Mage Chronicle, I could reach out to Gaia not necessarily just as a focus of belief as exists in any number of world cultures that have kind of this Earth Mother figure, but also that Gaia's emanations could be like, there is a special magic here that is me, and I want you to defend it in a way that could be both empowering, but also give you sufficient separation from Werewolf to either say, no, we got our own special mission, or alternatively, to really mess with werewolves who are like, hey, we're Gaia's chosen. In 1E, we get the idea that the original Dream Speakers were the mortals chosen by Gaia, which I think is a fascinating, albeit weird idea. Given the choice between that Dream Speakers and one that represents the world's indigenous cultures, I'm glad we have a tradition that represents the world's indigenous cultures. But still, that other idea I think is a neat locus that the Gaia could just be like, well, the furry chainsaws didn't work out well. Let's see what these monkeys are up to, and then ta-da, we get mages. The other thing I love is you make mention to Rage Across the Heavens, which is an absolutely fascinating book. If listeners are interested, have you had in Werewolf the Podcast a further discussion of that? Because that book is just, I love the sheer energy and enthusiasm it brings to the table.
Absolutely. We did a review of that book. If you're interested in hearing that review, it is a really odd, interesting, and intriguing book. Like, it is almost useless, but it has so many parts that you could take out and use at wholesale. But using it like as written as a chronicle, I don't know what I would do with that. That would just be bizarre to be like, you're stuck in the Umbra for 14 months traveling between all these planets to uncover the perfect Metis child, maybe, which is an interesting plot point.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I could certainly see Gaia being interpreted from a technocratic perspective to represent the potentiality of life or the sum total of information carried in all DNA. I always like the idea that deep within the Technoc are essentially mystery cults, that when you get that far into enlightenment, you can't tell the difference between Enochian sigils and somebody writing something out in a 6-base sequence DNA code in a foreign language with strange symbols in it. And sure. I just like those two meeting at the top.
I think that would be a really excellent way of showing the esotericism that, believe it or not, folks, exists within the scientific community in a way that you may not realize. There's a lot of superstition and esotericism built into science, the way we do science. And you get that deep into the weeds of it. And the difference between understanding how mitochondria work and your example of Enochian like sigils, kind of similar.
When I write out a reaction chain and I'm showing like alpha and beta structures and proteins moving back and forth during the brief period of time where I was dealing with biologics, that and how to summon Urshulgi to the uninitiated, nearly identical. And you use the term esotericism. There is a degree to which some people do actively try and keep the secret, either because it is a human institution and people like to preserve status, or you get into it enough and you just kind of lose the ability to talk to normies like us. And that is a mirror that I very much enjoy. And if I were to ever do a weird technocracy supplement, that would probably be one. Cults of the Technocracy, having that strange title right up front. Are there any other things that people should know kind of about Gaia, or a good place to get more information?
Obviously, Werewolf is going to have tons of information, but it is from a werewolf perspective. So you've got to dig through the weeds of their ridiculously ethnocentric or cultural centric viewpoint on everything to get anything that of concrete usefulness. Exalted, I think, is an interesting source for saying this is what Gaia could look like from a completely different perspective. But then you get into other elements that are not exactly similar to the modern world of darkness as well. But there are things you can play with there as well.
Yeah, Gaia in Exalted is one of the primordials, helps kind of form the reality that everyone interacts with. And that too has kind of a vague backstory, the tale between Gaia, Luna, and Autochthon, primordial craftsperson, I think is a kind of a fascinating story that maybe we will talk about on the show at one point. So Gaia appears in world cultures. In your opinion, do you think it makes sense in your game to use the term Gaia, or would it make more sense to you to kind of change it to something in the same way seemingly that Werewolf has done?
I would always decide what your local or cultural touch point is.
It seems to make sense. If you want to pick something that doesn't tie to human culture, make it. My thing is I try not to make any presentation of the cosmology in Mage make anyone flat out wrong. There is an aspect of truth. That culture's emanation is probably out there somewhere and may truck around with it. And all of these entities may share a court. And there is some ineffable being that is as far above them as they are above, again, us ground monkeys or something like that. So be generous. Try not to have anyone be directly wrong is usually a good starting point. Know what your cultural touchstones are and talk it over with your table.
Yep, for sure. So what is the first entity on your list, Terry?
The first entity I'm going to talk about is the August Personage of Jade, who you may know of as God. Is this the same as the head of the Abrahamic faiths? A lot of people certainly seem to think so. There is something super powerful out there that got everything going. is a common belief within the world of darkness. And in fact, within our world, Plato had the unmoved mover. Any number of cultures have some sort of skyfather or primordial agent that kind of kicked off existence. And it could be one of those things where they came from nothing, the idea of creation ex nihilo, or they could have emerged often from a form of primordial chaos, as happened with the Babylonian and Sumerian gods. In Mage, we refer to something called the Prime. This could or may not be the same thing as the One the Celestial Chorus talks about. Kindred of the East, though, which is a game line I know nearly nothing about except for the fact that it ties together a fair amount of cosmology if you wanted to, refer to an entity called the August Personage of Jade, who is this godlike entity who is in charge of keeping order to the cosmos. In Chinese mythology, the August Personage only talks to the emperor, and everyone else has to deal with some other god. They are served either by angels per Demon the Fallen or by the Yama kings in Wan Kuei per Kindred of the East. And is this the same as the creator god in Demon the Fallen? Maybe. They certainly seem to share a lot of things.
The interesting thing to add here is this being is also in Hengeyokai, which is the Shapeshifters of Asia supplement for Werewolf the Apocalypse, and separate from Gaia. They seem to be the same also. It is one of those moments where it's like, yes, Gaia, the August Personage of Jade, probably the same, but not. And we will talk about them separately, except for those few times when we're like, same. So that adds some layers of things.
As Josh mentioned earlier in our conversation, one neat thing that returns in the world of darkness is the idea that God or this entity has somehow turned their back on creation. Demon the Fallen presents what I think is the coolest version of it, that God created all things, but never touched creation directly, and only did so through agents and proxies, the various hosts that were responsible for creating reality. During the Divine Rebellion, though, God touched reality. The finite touched the infinite, or the finite was touched by the infinite. And the way it is kind of presented is that this maneuver caused the world of darkness's downward decay, that just broke a lot of things. This is presented in Mage the Ascension Revised in the book Ascension to say, if the world were working properly, all people would be able to change the world around them. People are obviously trying, but it's just not working for some reason. And only those who have an avatar seemingly are capable of making true change the way humans are supposed to. So the idea that God touching the finite somehow diminished God and maybe had to step away from creation, I think is perfectly fine. It could also be the case that God is on vacation. And in the world of darkness, history runs seemingly only about 15,000 years, and everything before that is just a big old question mark. So again, it could just be an entity that is operating on a timescale that is immeasurable. One of the other indications that we get is there is a procession to the order of the cosmos, and that God is in charge now, but we are approaching the next age where some demon lord will be in charge. And one of the ideas in Kindred of the East, or at least through the Ebon Dragon and the Scarlet Phoenix, is that we need to clean things up as much as possible. We cannot prevent the next age from starting, but if we do a good job, it will not be as long. The Age of Iron, the Sixth Age, the Demon King's era, whatever term that we want to use it, is going to be shorter. So how could you interact with God? No one has really claimed direct prophecy from the August Personage in any way that is generally recognized as legitimate. If the August Personage only talks to the Emperor and the line has been cut, maybe there's someone out there that claims that mantle and gets to talk to God again, or there is an Emperor out there that needs to be located, or the notion of what the Emperor is has changed over time. Again, I am not an expert in Chinese mythology or anything like that, but that is a route you could play, especially in a game where you can talk to a lawn chair. Just putting that out there. We talked about the idea that God is dead. Maybe out in space there is the inconceivably vast corpse containing God. We have the idea of the shells of creation that was introduced in the Book of the Fallen. Maybe those are just the body parts of a creator, and by rehabilitating those and clearing out the Nephandi, good luck with that, you could bring right order to the cosmos. It could also be the case that the August Personage only existed during a time when humans required a personal god to make sense of the world. God existed and thus retroactively existed, and then God went away as ideas like the ineffable came up again. As time goes on, our beliefs tend to allow for a more out there type of spirituality. And it may be a point where God has become so ineffable that their ability to interface with reality is not recognizable to us. It could be the case that God is dying, and this has made its way through the whisper networks of the High Umbra. This is the sign that we're in the last days of the era of the wheel, as the Euthanatoi call it, and either we need to make a last stand or we need to do some fixing up. There could also be a legacy throughout creation. This is something that's presented in Invisible Sun, Take a Drink, that there is a set of deeply embedded truths that grant understanding, and these objects function like grimoires, and they may be referred to as drops of God or bits of this cosmic entity. The race begins when one is discovered that appears to be a 1985 Memorex mixtape that God is alive and loves Huey Lewis, so that there could be these literal symbols that there seems to be a divine order in a weird way that does not make sense to most mages. And I very much like the idea of an active God that kind of is very confusing to people who really think they understand it. These are a bunch of ways to jam it in there. Are these, again, heretical in the eyes of a lot of people? Yeah, so maybe check with your table first. Do you have any thoughts about God, Josh?
I think the interesting thing there is, if you're interested in taking anything from Chronicles of Darkness, the idea of the God machine is into that like ineffable, completely confusing, why is it doing what it's doing sort of behavior, fully compatible with this sort of thing, particularly if you pull in the elements of cosmic bureaucracy as well, and that there is a system with people in charge of these systems, spirits, gods, whatever entities in charge of those systems. And then you have this being that is like so far out there that what they do just doesn't make sense to anything below them. I find that fascinating from a game perspective, really useful. Again, check with your table before you do anything related to that, because it may or may not be frustrating or offensive, and just, have that conversation. But there's a lot here that I think would be really cool to latch onto and talk about.
And I realize that Kindred of the East and Exalted are probably going to come up a bunch of times in terms of things that we can point you at for reference materials. I talked with Daniel Lozon about the God Machine, and which is this vast, incomprehensible entity in Chronicles of Darkness that observes what are referred to as occult physics and tries to have some sort of agenda which no one understands. And having a weird, vast, impersonal thing is kind of neat. Also, Chronicles of Darkness, my impression is a lot more of the game is focused on it happening on the mudball, the mundane side of reality. So to have a large, vast entity operating there lets you point the arrows back, as opposed to Mage, where you can get to a certain level where you're like, well, we're going to have a story to the Umbra. It kind of avoids that. But yes, the God Machine Chronicle has some information on that, and it also does a good job of it being cross-line in an interesting way. And it makes sense that of cases where several lines could run into each other, talking about cosmic entities could be one of them.
So that brings me to another set of cosmic entities that I think are useful to talk about. Again, I'm leaning on my werewolf knowledge to talk about them, but the Triat exist in Mage and Werewolf, and sort of in Demon, in this awkward sort of way, as long as you accept the demon's perspective that everything is true. That makes it hard to get a firm answer until you get out of the core book for Demon, and then they're like, we're just going to get rid of that whole everything is true angle and just tell you that everything is Judeo-Christian. But anyway, I won't digress too far about Demon. The Triat are the Weaver, the Wyld, and the Wyrm. These three beings that either created the universe or were created by Gaia to map and control and devise rules for the universe. In Werewolf and in Mage, frequently they are very personified. The Wyld, the Weaver, and the Wyrm are this triumvirate of entities that have a series of portfolios of control over reality. The Wyld effectively is the creative energy of the universe. The Weaver is the structuring entity of the universe, and the Wyrm is supposed to be the dissolver or destroyer that kind of recycles everything for the Wyld to pick up and be like, now I'm going to make things with it. The more you delve into what the Triad are, the less comprehensible or even sensible they are, because for the Wyld to do what it does, it also has to destroy things, because when with creating, it does so supposedly in this completely chaotic way. Everything created by it then is immediately structured by the Weaver. It doesn't fit if they are beings with agency that are making conscious choices. That is where I think things break down, is that there is this belief that they are entities with thoughts and feelings and agency. If you have them as just ineffable forces of the universe, I think that from a story point is easier to work with. When you get into this idea of them being entities with, again, agency, I'm not quite sure what you do with that. How does the Weaver think about things on a way that humanity can comprehend her actions? And even applying a pronoun to a being like the Weaver is probably wrong. Lots of people do. And the same with the Wyrm. If the Wyrm is this entity that in werewolf cosmology is being contained by the Weaver and then therefore corrupting the world, and it causing the world of darkness to be dark as it is, it just opens questions for, what do I do with this knowledge to make it actionable in a way that is comprehensible and creates a good story, rather than is just this weird attempt to explain how the universe works, which is a valid thing to have, just a thing that is completely odd and weird, and you're just saying this is how the universe works. But usually in these types of stories, you have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end that help you tell some particular thought or idea or concept. And I struggle often to do that in a way that isn't reductionist to what the Triat are supposed to be.
Do we ever get a depiction of them? Are they out there somewhere? Do they have realms? Do werewolves or could mages ever see them actually? Or are they also in the so vast at best you will see a reduction of a cliff notes?
Oddly, all of them have a umbral realm. Flux is the realm that is the Wyld. There is a Weaver realm in theory that can be got to. That is the only one that has like levels and emanations that probably aren't the Weaver realm, but there's discussions of it in Book of the Weaver and some other books where it's like the closer you get to the Weaver, the more stasis there is, so no one has ever gotten there and come back. The Wyrm lives in Malpheus, or Malpheus is the Wyrm. Malpheus being a hellscape, effectively, of corruption and hell. Is that the Wyrm? Is that just a cosmic made-up thing that the werewolves have decided exists, so it must exist, and then therefore does? There are no end-all be-all question or answers to these questions.
In Mage, it's kind of interesting. Previously, Mage tried to put space between the werewolf or Garou cosmology and what everyone else did, and you had instead dynamism, stasis, and entropy as the descriptor of the places. This maps to any number of real-world beliefs. You have the idea of the Trimurti, which is the trinity of supreme divinity that constitutes creation, maintenance, and destruction. Would I be comfortable mapping Shiva onto the Wyrm? No,
absolutely not.
Is Vishnu and the Weaver the same thing? No. The other thing to me, though, is I think it would be neat in Mage if every group had its own version of that. So, for instance, the technocracy would talk about the research lab, the market, and the scrap heap or something like that. And they would talk about it again in this kind of pseudo-mystical terms. And instead of saying stasis, they will say the marketplace will decide. And instead of them saying, let us see what goes into the hands of the great scrapper or something like that. Again, in this kind of pseudo-mystical setup that I like, that only exists seemingly in my game. And I do like the idea that the person is the place, that in the same way in Exalted, autochthonia is the body of autochthon, that the flux is the Wyld, that if your characters want to meet it, it is there, and all you need to know of them would be there. In Mage, we also get these places. Now, the question is, we get the idea of the Shanti, which are these realms that are geographically sometimes presented being deep in space, other times being part of the near Umbra. So somewhere between Earth and Mars, that's where the Weaver lives? That's a thing. Okay.
And does that make sense? I don't know. Maybe it does.
Exactly. Does it need to? Why are we asking these questions? Don't ask questions you already know the answers to, kids. If your characters want to encounter it, It makes sense to me that each of these entities would have their own court. They would have envoys that go to the High Umbra, or they themselves have emanations that can appear in the actual world. And when one of the problems is when you accumulate dots of quiet, you are increasing your connection to those Shanti. So one of the ways you have of resolving that is you go on the epic quest to cut your bond with it or to find the opposing one. One thing that has popped up in Werewolf's cosmology is there ever talk of there being a fourth part of it, or there being missing elements of that triad?
No, not explicitly, not at least that I remember. Now, I haven't read every single werewolf book yet. That was the plan. Who knows if it will ever occur, but there is overlap between the three entities that is always uncarefully described or not well defined, where there are things the Wyld does or beings that supposedly serve the Wyld that very clearly are doing things that otherwise, if they didn't say they were serving the Wyld, would be Wyrm aspected. And that just leaves lots of open questions to where are the lines, and what are these things that really exist separately, or are they just forces of the universe that we are personifying?
And if you had to list a few of your favorite agents of these entities, what would they be? Like any of their emanations, if they have them?
Yeah, the Wyld has what are called Gorgons, which are spirits of the Wyld that infuse beings of the world, and they shift and change and warp everything around them. Again, stealing something from Exalted, these sorts of wild zones at the edge of reality, that is something that Gorgons can do. They can warp and change the local reality around them. The Ratkin profess to be servants of the Wyld, their destruction and terrorism of the world. I find them really interesting, but I also would assume they probably don't actually serve the Wyld, they serve the Wyrm. To me, the Wyrm's servants are a multitude. The Nefandi supposedly serve the Wyrm in some versions of the Nefandi, but I find the Wyrm better used as a persistently ineffable corruption rather than being used by specific antagonists necessarily. Though Pentex is a great antagonist, them serving the Wyrm to me is incidental to their existence rather than just being a force of corruption and horrible capitalism in the world. And then the Weaver has drones. When it decides to create things, it will take spirits and infuse them into things and then control them directly, supposedly. I find them interesting, but I think, again, it's better to use the technocracy with a little bit of a stasis angle if you want to go that direction, or some elements of the glasswalkers who are Weaver aspected werewolves. If you want to dig into those sorts of things, I think those things become more interesting from that angle.
And I would be curious to see if we wanted to put everything in the Mage lens of giving different characters access to kind of avatars that any of these entities could produce, these entities are so large they are not necessarily beings so much as they are directions, in the same way that infinity is not really a number, that a character could have a 3 dots of Weaver Arete and they seemingly do magic that is very inflected through this thing and may or may not have paradox, and likewise they could have a drop of the August Personage or a drop of Helios to them, and just giving you a systematic and philosophical kind of framework that these are all entities large enough that even being touched by their essence is enough to trigger this kind of understanding that allows the force of will to start changing reality around you. So again, we could all be pawns in this great war when we cannot even see the generals that are waging it. The next one I have is, again, sticking with low complexity, straightforward entities, Ialdabaoth or the Demiurge. Ialdabaoth or the Demiurge is an entity who is responsible for creating the flawed material prison that we all inhabit in some way. Plato refers to the Demiurge as a kind of crafter that fashioned the physical universe. The Apocryphon of John, written in the 2nd century CE, made mention of a lesser god that claims to have created the world. Ialdabaoth, there's any number of ways of spelling it, frequently called the lion face, and is said to have the body of a serpent and the face of a lion. Ialdabaoth has a few interpretations. One is that it created the cosmos in imitation of the immaterial perfection of what God did. Everything kind of sucks, Because when you look at what God did and was able to create in perfection, creating a material and by definition, at least in this philosophy, flawed version is going to suck. And that being is just kind of a lesser entity that is somewhere between a tyrant or a maintainer or somebody just running around going, oh, I hope Dad doesn't find out what you did, if you got a bunch of mice as a gift and forgot to feed them. Another interpretation that has existed in philosophy is that Ialdabaoth was jealous of humanity being created and that we originally had a more divine nature and was jealous of that direct access to the divine that we had, so forged this prison around us. Here, Ialdabaoth is a kind of divine jailer, and I think this is kind of the interpretation that is used in the game Cult. That divine spark that we have that reminds us of our true heritage could be the Avatar, and Ialdabaoth's mission could be to snuff out all of them as possible. Could be this Lord of Demons that when all the avatars are destroyed, the prison will be perfect and we will never be able to recontact with the great infinite that is our birthright. Another option is that this devil is merely the idea of evil, that Ialdabaoth and evil or ill are just kind of the same thing. There is no pointy-tailed being in charge of all of it, and Ialdabaoth is simply the sum total of all wickedness. There are a lot of other belief systems that have some kind of fallen entity that was once close to the creator. I was originally going to list them all, but a lot of them use character systems I am not familiar with and put letters next to each other that I don't know how to say. Often this being has lower emanations involved in the maintenance of the world. The idea is since Ialdabaoth is imperfect, they are incapable of creating perfection, meaning their creation needs to be upkept and maintained. And this feeds into the idea that if our universe were created by some lesser being, that is why the world of darkness is running down. These beings can either be separate or also coterminous with the whole. The example I will use is in Exalted, take a drink, in that all the primordials also have constituent souls that are both individual entities and part of them. And if any of their constituent souls change, if they are killed or changed or manipulated with, that kind of indirectly affects that overbeing. So for instance, we can use this in a game if we say that the emanations of one of these higher powers can be manipulated and that can work its way back up. You may not be able to kill Helios in a game, but your group may set about to kill Apollo to make space within Helios for a new description of what the sun is. This is where you have a lot of space to go back to the one-y, somewhat trippy interpretation of everything that we just haven't really seen in a while. Mentions to Ialdabaoth are made in a number of texts, Celestial Course 1 ebook, Book of Worlds, and both Books of Madness. In Books of Madness, they are kind of more towards that divine jailer, bad person thing, or you could just view it as Ialdabaoth is kind of a mascot for the Nefandi. Like, Ialdabaoth has no concept of what these worshippers are doing, but they're like, yeah, get in there, maintainer of a flawed cosmos. Way to show that we're fundamentally screwed. Within the books, we get the presentation that Ialdabaoth can be a literal, impossibly cunning serpent that leads all demons. Some could view it as simply the laws of physics. Ialdabaoth could be the embodiment of the second law of thermodynamics, that things are just going to run down. I like there being an idea that there is a fight between mages who believe paradox is a punishment from the jailer and successful vulgar magic will wake up the consensus and all other mages, which ties in very closely to what the Toftani are doing, or at least were in previous editions. We don't have a lot of M20 information. Another group could say magic is just another trick used to bind the hands of the clever, that there could be some greater magic that we are supposed to be performing. The pure ones could have been beings that were attempting to bring the divine spark to us, but that shattered either in contact with the imperfect world or because of Ialdabaoth. Ialdabaoth is dead, their body is in the far horizon somewhere, and that is what the gauntlet is, and it is protecting us from creepy space stuff. If one looks back from the deep umbra far enough, one could literally see the great serpent ringing the earth. Again, there's no maps out there, so you kind of do whatever you want. Do you have any thoughts about a divine jailer or a creator of an imperfect cosmos?
If you want to go that angle, it's really intriguing. It is in some ways both compatible and incompatible with these other elements that we've talked about, though. Like, you've got to decide if this is true for your cosmos, how does that interact with everything else that people believe? Either they're wrong and the jailer has created these things as tools for controlling people within their jail, or they are trying to stop everything else from interacting with the world. And then you have to have active agents of this being doing things to prevent the people that believe the truth, whatever the truth again might be. That can be a really fun game. It gets really complicated really quickly, potentially, but there's, I think, things you can do with this idea if you want to even have it be that the world of darkness is a prison. It is not the world as a whole. It is this specific world is, I'm pulling on things from Ravenloft in the Dungeons and Dragons space, where there is a specific plane where there is this world that is a prison for all these dark beings. Perhaps it is that the world of darkness is a prison for specific beings, and everything else around them is simply a fabrication for their prison to play on them.
Oh, wow. This brings in interesting questions about kind of like the simulation hypothesis too, where it's like, yeah, you're a mage. If you open yourself up to the true potential, these bad things are going to get out and destroy the over-reality. But at the same time, you're kind of stuck as this piece of lawn ornamentation to distract some great outer horror evil that will consume true reality should it ever get out. And part of you may be like, I don't want reality to be destroyed. That's where my stuff is.
And some of you might be like, you know what? I don't want this prison to exist any longer. And in some ways you can make, not that I necessarily agree with making Nefandi righteous, but you could make a case where there are righteous Nefandi who are like, we want to destroy this prison so that this darkness can be destroyed, so that the good reality that we belong in is something we can return to.
Mm-hmm.
That is a thing.
The sheer amount of space for everyone to be right and wrong about the same things in this is part of what I enjoy. And it's also one of those ones where a storyteller can go really far without tipping their hand. And even at the end of a chronicle that tries to face fundamental questions like this, you may not give players an answer. Like there's any number of situations in the Ascension book where it's like, yeah, reality's not what it used to be. And you're like, what the dink does that mean? We're like, like, what does what does it mean for us to rejoin the reality? Like, is that just death? And if nothing else, Mage is frequently a game about just talking about things and no actual plot occurring. So this sounds perfect.
Absolutely.
Speaking of things that form a prison for us, which is to say the outside world that Jodish and I were talking about, can you tell us about some of the great sky objects in Werewolf and who they are?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about them in a whole. I think that would be the best way of doing so. Each of the 9 celestial bodies in our planetary system have an emanation attached to them. 10 actually celestial bodies. Oh, I don't know how you want to count them, because that gets confusing really quickly. The planets all have an emanation. The sun has an emanation. The moon has an emanation. All of the other little like moons and the asteroid belt have an emanation of being attached to them, an avatar that reflects their personality to some degree. And or again, it's a complete construct of the Geru or other people who are just like, yeah, of course these beings exist and they're creating them in the consensus. Regardless, Helios or the sun exists as a separate entity. Luna exists as a separate entity that impact the earth and have agency and have the ability to choose beings to be their servants on Earth, taking specific actions in service to them. And all of the other planets can do so too. And the asteroid belt can do so too, because maybe it used to be a planet. The asteroid belt in particular, or the Incarnae of Rorg, one of my favorites. It's an angry, fractured being who believes in hunting things, is a creature focused on the hunt. Super interesting, super engaging. Again, Rage Across the Heavens if you want to know more about Rorg. All of these beings are tied to their specific celestial thing in some form or another, though, which limits your ability to go out and check out Pluto in theory. But Mage has the ability to go to these shade realms,
shard realms,
realms. Yeah. I don't know. One of those things.
Yeah, it's kind of a messy one, because we have the idea that you have the celestial body. It may or may not have its own penumbra, but it has some sort of realm, which we call the shard realms, which some people argue are the planets, and Mage is inconsistent about the language. And then each of those casts a shadow on the horizon, at least in second edition, but in revised, they became free-floating other places that were tied to a sphere, kind of, called a shade realm. And some have both a umbral reflection and their own penumbra, depending on how close it is. So, yeah, if anyone is confused, you have company.
Right. And what I find interesting is, as far as I remember, Mage never ties in the Incarnae from Werewolf and says these beings exist within these realms. They just don't appear. It's seemingly non-essential from a Mage perspective to be there. And if you want a being that fully represents this particular place, if you're going to Uranus or Neptune, then it is interesting to have a being like Gaia. Again, if you use Gaia, be an element of the story that you're telling from those places where you're saying these objects are large enough to have their own spiritual emanation. And that opens a larger question of, is that true of the entire universe? And if it is the case that our solar system, the universe, the galaxy, all have their own emanations of themselves, all these spiritual things, again, what does that mean? Is God simply a way of describing all of these things as a collective being living within an organism, quote unquote, that is reality? Who knows?
Yeah. In Void Engineers Revised, we get the idea that all levels of reality, all levels of informational accumulation generate their own level of reality. That just having stuff out there generates its own reality. The digital web is the byproduct of information being enough out there to kind of organize reality around it. And it could be the case that there was some primordial cosmos that shattered during this fight, and each of the Celestines got its own little dominion in the form of a planet. That could be literally that fight. It could be a literal metaphor for the accretion disk that formed the solar system. It could also be the case that we saw these objects in the sky and humans thought there was something there, and just the collective belief of humanity then created the entity. They could be other attempts at creating life, and it just so happened that Gaia won. We get the line in Ascension that Mars is jealous of Earth for her ability to support life. So it could go any direction or kind of all of them. We do know that the emanations from these Celestines that is the level at which in Mage we do have some interaction. You probably won't interact with the Celestine Jupiter, but Jupiter has several manifestations, and those do run around in the umbral courts, and that is presented, and to me that is perfectly reasonable as a thing that you could create a bond with if you wanted a spirit patron of some sort, or you wanted to receive a boon in exchange for a ban or something while you're running around the courts. Planets have any number of correspondences in mortal belief. I think there are enough, for instance, hermetics running around that if they say Mars is the realm of forces and you encounter Mars is going to be a perfectly acceptable mentor or tutor for it. One of the things that Werewolf does that I like is all of these entities have also weird other names and have a set of dominion and focus to it. So I like the idea of there being enough werewolves and enough kinfolk to generate the belief to allow a planet to have domain over something to help a mage.
All of that's really cool. The problem with it is there's a demographic issue for the actual creation of all those things. But yes, if you are creating a world where that fits your demographics, then run with it.
My thought is that the belief of mages and the belief of supernatural entities, except for vampires, screw vampires, is potent enough that there is enough there that a mage could draw it. The idea is, yes, there aren't tens of millions of werewolves, but each werewolf, because of the litany and so on, and because of the importance of storytelling, their belief in the story of Uranus is so potent that it counts for 10,000 sleepers or something like that. Or there's something weird out there that they are tapping into. And if you want to make those Incarnae weird other things that are trying to destroy humanity, I think that's totes cool too, especially if you have the planets each has the core of its own court represented by its moons or other celestial bodies and so on. There's a lot of neat directions you can go here. Do they get their own realms and such?
They get their own realms. They get their own courts, which you describe. They get their own servants and other beings that interact with them, reflected by their moons and reflected by the other spirits that live within their realms. There is so much to play with there, particularly if you want to have Neptune decide to go and wage war against Earth. And now you have this planetary body doing things in quote unquote the real world that are confusing scientists. And in the spiritual layers of the world, there is a war going on where these spirit beings are riding to Earth on hippogriffs, or I'm trying to think of dolphins or other weird things like that, and are striking out at mages and the Earth and maybe werewolves. There's lots of fun stuff you can do with that as a plot line.
Yeah, and these could just be reflections of mortal belief if you want to keep everything grounded on humanity. Mm-hmm. The discord of Neptune being the incarnate associated with mind, Neptune is fracturing, and this could be your metaphor for the era of fake news or what have you. And you either have to write Earth or write Neptune, either one, to kind of repair this. One of the cases where Mage and Werewolf overlap in a delightful way is their ability to make the literal metaphorical and vice versa in a way that I find super fun.
Book of the Wyld, Book of the Wyrm, Book of the Weaver give you some things if you want to use the Triad as well, but like of the Celestines, Rage Across the Heavens.
The last two I have are kind of weird cases. One is that Mage has made various mentions to cosmic entities that are out there in some way. For instance, in Book of Madness introduces the Crawler at the end of space, which is an entity on the surface of a neutron star, which by looking at it, somebody turned into a Nefandus. To me, I think this is more accurately a case of someone got super obsessed with it and would do anything to find out more so than somebody who walked into an actual call. Still, that's fine. And it includes this line: when the Pure Ones first set to weaving the tapestry of the Tellurian, they were like children playing random games with the raw way of being, tangled threads of prime into twisted knots of polar charges, light and dark, order and chaos, time and space. Some of these knots were so highly charged that they pulled in upon themselves, looping into infinitely hot, dense realms that strained at the fabric of reality, sucking up any loose threads of quintessence. When the patterns of the realm of Gaia were completed, the myriad beauties of her spheres, her lands, her lives fulfilled at the center of her tapestry, while the failed experiments of the knot realms clung to the outer fringes of being, clenched into the naked warp and weft of time and space. But even within their impressive tiny realms, consciousness took root. Some Nefandi say they were the first Pure Ones to go insane, seeking to unravel the complexities of their failures and binding themselves in the process. And dark eyes opened in awakening and turned to the distantly shining realm of Gaia. I don't know about you. That sounds really effing cool, Josh.
It's super neat.
Yup. I have no idea what to do with it, but I'm glad it's there.
This is my thing with a lot of these things, like these, particularly these Cthulhu-esque entities, is what will I do with this knowledge? How will I take these extraneous creatures and bring them into reality in a way that allows people to take an action in response to or in support of or whatever of the agenda of these things? That is an open question. And that, as a storyteller, if you want to use them, you have to decide what purpose, what move can your antagonists blame on this being and have it all make sense.
And again, the question is going to be, what agents does it have and how does it represent itself? We get the idea that the Crawler Beyond the Stars has the ability to interface people through minds. The idea being it is gravitically bound, so anything that has no mass and no energy to it, it is able to interact with. I like the idea that the Pure Ones weren't so pure. They were just the ones who kind of won the first big fight. I like the idea of, as I mentioned before, there being other mage-like entities out there. We know the Nephandic ones that look like pure evil, but what if there is a more beatific one that we can't identify? I find that to be kind of an interesting angle, that these are people that so intimately either have a realm that a character looking for archmastery would want to go to, or they have, since they were around before physics have an insight into the working of creation. And it could be just one of those things where, like, yeah, every time you talk to him, you get a point of quiet. It could be any one of them, but you will receive a understanding that is absolutely sublime. And just to pull back the curtain initially, this was going to be a conversation originally on the Cthulhu mythos. And in a lot of the Cthulhu games, the idea of sanity is not a question of what we would call madness, but the degree to which your character believes the assumptions and lies that protect us from an uncaring and oppressive cosmos. And these could be entities that are, of necessity, you kind of have to abandon some of that to recognize their existence. And I think taking away the good versus evil angle makes it more interesting. If we are all just ants upon this small speck that Gaia has made inhabitable in a massive cosmos, what right do we have to ban these other things from creation? And that is another question that comes up in Exalted. If Malagon of the Green Flame, just as a side effect of living, emits radiation that kills everything within 30 feet of him, to some extent, it's not really his fault. It's just kind of who he is. I'm not going to invite him to a dinner party or anything. So I like the idea that the Nefandi and so on are not interfacing with malice, just those things that are incredibly alien. And we kind of lose that in M20, and I miss it. I get why you really want to focus on human evil, but I don't know. I just love the Cult of the Star Squid sometimes.
Yeah. I think if you want to play on the idea that there are ineffable horrors in the universe that are trying to, one, exist, and two, maybe devour everything in existence, just because, not because they're aggressively evil, but we as humans go out and eat things around us constantly. Are we doing so because we have any sort of aggressive tendencies towards cows or plants? I don't like cows, but other people have no strong opinions toward them. So like the idea that there are things out there that eat planets and universes, interesting, particularly if then there are ants that collect around them and go, we want you to know that we love you. And they're like, I don't even recognize you exist, but if you say you love me, good for you.
Yeah. What I'll refer to as the Galactus Problem. And you may come up with a cosmology where these entities are required in the same way that Gaia could be kind of viewed as a cancer upon the universe, that Gaia needs to be kept in check, or the pristine order of the cosmos will be disrupted through unalloyed life. And maybe your characters need to prevent that generative force from going throughout the universe. Again, not really big on street level games, but I think there's certainly a lot of interesting play place to go in here. And you mentioned things that just kind of want to consume everything, either because they have to, or that is their way of understanding, or that's just kind of what they do. The last entity I have is Grandmother. After the Week of Nightmares, something wakes up and starts tearing across the underworld with an army of specters, which is kind of evil ghosts who've given into oblivion. This entity is called Grandmother after it is described as a grandma, which kind of sounds like grandma. She was awakened by the Sixth Maelstrom and is starting to consume her Malfian children, much to their chagrin. So the Neverborn and the Onceborn are being taken in, seemingly working her way out of the consuming labyrinth that lies below the Tempest, that is below the Shadowland, which is below reality. In a world in which God is gone, that is a bad thing. Grandmother is sometimes referred to as God's evil twin, the remains of a dead universe, and also that she has no idea what she's doing. She is just reincorporating into herself all things. And this is kind of the plot line we get through Orpheus, which is absolutely fascinating. And I like the way the game is like, well, you don't really have a lot of supernatural power, so who should we put you up against? Something that can consume all of reality and is doing so without too much difficulty and is just rolling the Neverborn.
Right.
Which into a single one was suggested as to be the power behind all of the Nefandi. So just to give you an idea what tier we're kind of talking to. Again, we get the idea in Mage that there are shells of abandoned universes. Maybe Grandmother is one that woke up. Characters tied to the dead find that ghosts are going missing or turning into specters. As Grandmother gains more power, ghosts are hurriedly trying to materialize to get out of the way. And now you see a world full of shamblers and poltergeists and so on. Mortal sorcerers find that they can do certain effects more easily as this giant entity that they can draw upon exists. She's eating up Nefandi, which at first seems good. later bad, and maybe that gives her a taste for the living and kind of dooms all of us. Grandmother also produces something called memory towers. Since all the specters that are part of Grandmother form this massive hive mind, to prevent someone from tapping into that and knowing all of her secrets, they are kept in memory towers where the memory is protected from even Grandmother herself. And there's all sorts of interesting things in there, whether they be truths that Grandmother does not want to reckon with, or that relics or other things that can be the means of her defeat. Grandmother is presented as an interesting counterpoint to God. Maybe God created everything and set things in motion. The laws of physics allow it to persist, and the role of Grandmother is to end them all. We don't get a huge amount of information on how this impacts any of the other lines. Orpheus kind of occurred in its own weird little side thing, but it's a fascinating idea. And if you're looking for more information, the World of Darkness wiki has a lot of information on it. It's pretty well populated, at least enough to get a Mage game up and running if you're like me and you have a disproportionate fondness for the underworld. What do you think about the dark side of God consuming the underworld and eventually coming for us mortals?
The odd thing is I have a memory, and I cannot find the source for it, of Grandma being referenced in Werewolf. And I believe it is in connection with the Abyss, which I believe is the realm that I'm thinking of, that is a dark cut in everything that goes down to nothingness and oblivion effectively. And it is referred to as the Grandma. So I have not read all of Orpheus. I have skimmed all of it, but I've never deeply read it. So the idea of them kind of taking this basic concept and saying, well, what if oblivion just starts eating everything and it is an entity of some sort, I think is fascinating. I would go so far as to say it would be really interesting if this was God, and instead of being another being, it was God waking up and going, what has happened while I was sleeping? What have I dreamed? I don't like any of this. Let me clean up my pillow of all of this mess, because this isn't cool.
I think that's a fascinating thing. In the same way that Ialdabaoth is our divine jailer, this could be the true reality exerting itself. And the question is, what lengths does the illusion want to go to keep itself in existence? That's pretty cool. We get some weird mirrors that it lies below the abyss, and this could be a weird connection between demon and the La Sombra and the black spiral. I love the fact that it creates a huge space for supernatural conspiracies that aren't just mortal conspiracies. But if you want to bring in the saucer people or Nordic aliens, by all means, I will never stand in your way of doing that. We talked a lot about a lot of things, and I think we did a good tear through. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I think you have to ask yourself, if you're using a being like this, or beings like this plural, how they're going to impact your game. You can run a street level game and at the basis of everything decide that Grandma is awakening and have that fit your story. You have to decide the level of the impact, though, on your story, where you can just be talking about the slow degradation of a particular neighborhood. And at the very end of this story that your mages have been pushing against the degradation of their neighborhood and are trying to rebuild things and try to put things right, the world just collapses around them. And they are left there pushing back against the void at the end and being aware that they are the last thing standing against nothing. And now, some people love that sort of nihilism. Some people would be like, how dare you do that to me in a game? But these types of entities make you make those choices on a deep level about how their impact is going to show itself in the game to game, session to session thing that you are doing. It is fun to start with these sorts of things and then play downward until you get to these are the actions. This is the plot of my particular story.
And I think there is also a way to interpret plots like that as also always being a metaphor where you are bearing down it. And that could be represented by your group's choice to oppose or encourage a housing development or to help a person in need, that they are the microcosm. Do they choose to be the avatar of the Wyrm by allowing putrescence to creep into their neighborhood or a place that they love? Or do they resist, possibly to their own detriment? These are games where the metaphorical becomes literal, but I think we can also do the opposite. There's an interpretation for all of these entities where Ialdabaoth is merely the human inclination towards suffering and focusing on our own immediate surroundings, where God is merely the personification of the potential of the cosmos and doesn't actually need to be a being. No one needs to be right. So I think that arrow can go both ways, and I think that is good advice.
I think people should go and read the White Wolf Wiki for all of these things that we've talked about, because there will be useful things. Go do a Google search on some of these things we talked about, and then go out there and run some games. If you're not running games, please go out and run a game right now.
Yeah. Josh, thank you for joining us. Are there any particular projects you're doing right now that you would like to point us at?
People should be listening to Opcast, Arms Around the Trinity Continuum. If you are not listening to Opcast, you are not my friend. I'm not happy with you. It is a in-depth review and discussion on all things Trinity Continuum, both the original White Wolf books and the current Onyx Path publications. I have a lot of fun with my co-hosts. I love Trinity Continuum, so you get to hear me be really excited about things. So I think you should go and do that.
It is a nice change of pace. And for the audience, just so you know, Josh did survive a Bastet Celian attack during the show, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Josh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sarah.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we embrace all the cosmic entities of the world of darkness out there, except for the sticky ones. Our show is made possible by our executive producers, who include Buck Farmer, Oracle of Dwarf Planet Maki Maki, the crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Dwarf Planet Haumea, Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Dwarf Planet Series, Mikhail, Oracle of the Dwarf Planet Eris, Jay Widener, Oracle of Dwarf Planet 225088 Gong Gong, which is just kind of a cool name in my opinion. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Boo, Boogers, Brad of the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppin, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Simsek, Gargle Noir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason Vines, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Josh H., Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Napero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shoutout is to Jason W. Briggs, who I think I've accidentally been calling Jason W. Biggs this whole time, which makes me think of Biggs Darklighter, pilot of Red 3 at the Battle of Yavin from the Star Wars films. Noted friend of Jed Porkins, Biggs had a larger role in the film, but many of his scenes were cut, including one set at Tachi Station. The scene of him at the battle hangar was later added back to the special edition version, which means I've purged it from my memory, along with Episode 9. Biggs was going to make an appearance in Star Wars Rebels, but even that was cut, and his character was replaced with Wedge Antilles. In an early draft, he was also Luke's brother. Thanks, Jason. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or at matesthepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop and Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform you're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to matesthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye. I almost said Booberian Gods, which is a god powered by blueberries. So when you and I talk about things that have no disagreement and are universally believed to be acceptable in all games, I think the first two things we think about are Kindred of the East and the presentation of the Menace. I will probably cut that. That is even far too much sarcasm for me. Oracle of the largest object in the solar system with no Incarnae. Yo mama. Please know that I passed this joke by my spouse, and as soon as I said, hey honey, would this be an appropriate joke for Mage the Podcast, she yelled, if it's a yo mama joke, they seem to be cool again. Thanks, honey. I should probably cut that.